Well, welcome everyone. Um, this is essentially our sixth webinar. Six, yes. So we're more than halfway done, and today we're going to transition into talking about what you call domain satisfaction. So we'll focus on discussing much of the research that is involved in different domains meaning, work life, family life, social life, leisure life, and so forth. Okay, so let me start out by sharing my screen. I hope you can see the first slide, which again focuses on, the title would be Psychology of Wellbeing, Module 4. You see the module are broken down by the different parts of the book. So we're into the fourth part of the book. And again, we're focusing on life domains and their effects on well-being. You can see the slide, right? Okay. So again, this is how things are broken down by the book. And we're focusing on life domains and their effects on happiness. And again, we're going to start this module, and it focuses on chapters 16 to 23. Again, bunch of chapters. So this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the domain dynamic, the interplay between and among the different life domains, and the feelings that people have about those domains, and ultimately how it affects the overall sense of well-being, i.e., for example, life satisfaction is a sort of a translation of that. And then again, we'll focus on much of the research related to work well-being, residential well-being, material or economic well-being, social, family, and marital well-being, health well-being, and leisure well-being. And there's a whole bunch of other types of well-being, but again, we're going to focus on these because there's so much research in these areas. So start out with, let's talk about to set the stage to understand work well-being, leisure well-being, family well-being, and so forth, and the research related to these different life domains. We probably need to understand the whole concept of life domains and how we invest feelings in those different life domains affecting our overall sense of well-being. So back in the early 70s, a precursor to the well-being research movement in quality of life is the movement related to social indicators research, social indicators. And social indicators research dates back from the early 70s. And there were two books, they're essentially seminal in nature, that captured the quality of life in the United States. One was by Andrew Withy, Andrew and Withy, and the other one is Campbell, Converse, and Rogers. These are considered to be seminal in the social indicators movement, and it was based on a major, social survey of people in the United States. Based on these two books, it was documented and demonstrated very clearly that people, when they think about their overall life, when they're asked about how do you feel about your life at large, in general, people tend to think of terms of how they feel about their life in terms of certain domains. So people think about their family domain. They think about their social life. They think about their work life. They think about their spiritual life, and so forth. And they tend to make judgments about their life at large based on how they feel in terms of those life domains. You know, the affect, the feelings, the emotions that they have invested in different life domains. And those life domains that seem to be prominent or salient in their mind, on top of their mind, tends to influence their judgment about how they feel about their life at large, in general. So Andrew and Withy and Campbell and Converse, what they did is they were able to capture domain satisfaction in relation to a whole bunch of different life domains. Then much of the research in social indicators started looking at the interplay between satisfaction in one life domain on another. So this kind of sets the stage, as you can see from the slide. The seminal theories related to life satisfaction, quality of life, were very much based on bottom-up, top-down, and horizontal theories of spillover. Again, we talked about that, but again, briefly, let me just sort of refresh your memory. So the idea of bottom-up, and that is life satisfaction as a judgment that people make about themselves, is very much based on how they feel in their, what you might call, respective life domain. So how do they feel about their work life? How they feel about their family life, leisure life, social life, and so forth. So that satisfaction, that life satisfaction judgment is very much grounded or very much influenced by a bottom-up meaning, again, satisfaction that are invested in those life domains. They travel up, right, from bottom to up. And if you want to go further down in the context of each one of those life domains, when I ask you, how do you feel about your family life? Well, then you look at specific issues, specific concerns, major concerns in your family, and you think about that and says, I feel good or bad about my family life, and ultimately family life affects my judgment about my life at large, right? So that's a sort of it's a pyramid that goes from the very bottom to the very top. The very bottom would be feelings about specific life concerns, within those different life domains, and again, influencing the overall judgment of how people feel about those domains. We call them domain satisfaction, all the way up to, the judgment related to life satisfaction. That has been the foundation of the social indicators movement. And again, those seminal books that I was telling you about, Andrews and Withy and Campbell, Converse and Rogers, provided the foundation for understanding subjective quality of life, and that translated into subjective well-being that Ed Diener and the psychologists that followed him set, again, the other foundation dealing with subjective well-being, and then Martin Seligman came in and talked about positive psychology, and the whole movement blossomed into a huge well-being type of a field of study. Top down, on the other hand, we talked about how when a person has feelings about his or her life at large, how it affects domain satisfaction. So if you feel happy about at large, then it's very likely that that will influence how you would feel in those different life domains: work life, family life, leisure life, and so forth. That's a top-down type of an influence. And how you feel about those different life domains affects how you feel about specific concerns, right, within those life domains. So it's a top-down influence. And then we talked about horizontal. Horizontal spillover is how, when you, however you feel about your family life, how that spills over to your work life, and how, again, that may spill over to your social life and so forth. So there is horizontal spillover between and among those life domains. Again, these are seminal theories in the social indicators movement that provided the foundation of for the study of well-being at large. Then much research was developed based on what we call segmentation theory. Again, we're looking at the interplay between and among those domains and satisfaction within domain. We talk about them as domain satisfaction. And segmentation theory, as you can see from the second bullet on the slide, focuses on how people tend to segment and insulate life domains. So their satisfaction within a specific life domain becomes insular in the sense that people wrap around a border. They establish a border around a specific life domain. And these domain and the satisfaction invested in those domains become insular. They are insulated from any kind of spillover. So again, if we're talking about segmentation would be like the counterpoint, would be the opposite of horizontal spillover. People segment those domains, segmented those domains, and they erect borders, impermeable borders. And then you'd say, well, why would people do that? Well, let me give you an example. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in the context of work well-being. So let's say if we're looking at two domains, work life and family life, and if a person experiences much dissatisfaction with work life, would that person bring all the troubles that he or she is experiencing in work life to home life? Well, some people, what they do is they try and cope by developing those borders. What's at work stays at work. What, in the family, when I'm at home, I'm with the family. I don't bring my trouble to the home front. That is what we call a segmentation strategy. So in this person, in the context of this person, as an example, that person, creates a border, an impermeable border between work life and family life. This is what we call segmentation theory. Okay? Segmentation. Compensation theory, again, deals with the interplay between and among those different life domains, in the sense that if a person expresses or feels quite a bit of dissatisfaction in one life domain, all of a sudden, well, I wouldn't say all of a sudden, in order to cope with that kind of dissatisfaction, what they do is they compensate. Compensate how? Well, they compensate in two ways. They compensate by devaluing the domain in which they feel dissatisfied. So let's say if a person becomes very dissatisfied at work, meaning work life is, there's a lot of negative feelings about work. So how does the person cope with these negative feelings? The person convinces himself or herself that work is not that important in the big scheme of life, in the big scheme of things. Work is only work. It doesn't really matter. So the person compensates by investing much of resources in terms of time, energy, and possibly money in another life domain that is likely to bring him or her much satisfaction. So that person, turns to religion maybe. Spirituality and religion become so important, and it would take precedence over work life. So now that person, values spirituality and religion in such a way that he or she is investing much more resources in that domain and decreasing their resources in work life. So this is compensation. What you're doing is you're investing more in another domain, ultimately to generate a lot more satisfaction in that domain to compensate for the dissatisfaction that you're experiencing in another domain. And therefore, you by doing this, you maintain an acceptable level of life satisfaction. An acceptable level of life satisfaction. So people are always monitoring that level of life satisfaction. And if it dips below a certain level, well, what they look is where that dissatisfaction is coming from, and they try and engage in a compensatory mechanism. That's compensation theory. It deals with the interplay between and among those life domain, or what we call domain satisfaction. Another theory is balance theory. And this is something that actually I wrote quite a bit about. My first book was way back in 2002. And in that book, I discussed, lots of ideas about balance, how people try and balance domain satisfaction between and among those different life domains. And the idea is very simple, and that is people do not put all their eggs in one basket. What does that mean? Let me repeat that. In order to feel satisfied, happy with life, you do not, or most people do not put all their eggs in one basket. Let me try and get you to understand this concept of putting all your eggs in one basket. Let's say if we have a person who is a workaholic, meaning that person that invests so much time, energy, and also money in work life. Everything else doesn't matter. Family life doesn't matter. Leisure life doesn't matter. Doesn't have much of a social life. I talk about workaholics being married to their jobs, right? And then that person becomes unemployed, becomes laid off. What's going to happen to his life satisfaction? If that person, because he is a workaholic, he is investing so much of himself in work life, and then all of a sudden doesn't have a job, doesn't have much of a work life because he becomes unemployed, well, that person's life dissatisfaction will plummet, right? In essence, that person's, a dissatisfaction in a very salient life domain, such as work, and dissatisfaction in that domain would ultimately strongly influence satisfaction with life at large. And that person ultimately becomes depressed, clinically depressed. And that's why we see quite a bit of research on the relationship between unemployment and life satisfaction. It's a very strong negative relationship between these two, especially for men. Why men? Because men invest so much of their identity in their work life. And therefore, if they become dissatisfied in work life, they become dissatisfied with life at large. That's balance theory. So the idea is that for those people who have a higher level of life satisfaction or a general sense of well-being, tend to invest themselves in multiple domains. Multiple domains. That means experiencing satisfaction in work life and family life and leisure life and social life and spiritual life, on, is important. Investing oneself only in one or two domains is bad. Bad in the sense that, again, if something negative happens to this one or two domains, your life crashes. That's balance. So the idea is investing in multiple domains is key to achieving life satisfaction through a balance strategy. You balance those domains, and by creating that kind of balance, again, you're optimizing life satisfaction. Detraction theory. Do you have any questions about any of this so far? So far, so good. Okay. I'm looking at the chat box. Nothing in the chat box. Detraction theory. Detraction theory. Well, as the name of that theory, it's sort of the name gives it away. Let me give you an example first, and then we'll talk about the mechanics of detraction theory. How about a drug addict? Well, that person invests so much time, energy, and money trying to get high, right, through drugs. Substance abuse. By doing so, that person, of course, ends up getting high. So that person ends up feeling very happy, short-term, momentary happiness, right? But doing so, the drug itself takes away from being able to invest in other life domains that are so important to happiness, right? So, investing in so much time, energy, and resources in acquiring the drug and getting high, again, detracts from being able to achieve important life goals related to family, important life goals related to social life, to leisure life, to community life, on and on. It's a detraction. In one way, you can actually apply the concept of workaholism. I mean, workaholics tend to, again, feel detracted from being able to invest, time, energy, and money in important life domains to achieve important life goals that ultimately lead to an overall sense of well-being, life satisfaction. That's the traction theory. Role conflict theory is also a major theory that provided a foundation of much of the psychology of work well-being, and it talks about how we as people, we assume roles. We have a role for being a father, a mother, a parent, a teacher, a caretaker, on and on, right? We assume so many roles in different life domains. And those roles play a very important part in domain satisfaction. So when we, let's say in the context of family life or home life, whatever roles we assume the role of, again, being a parent, being the teacher, being the chauffeur, being the cook, right? Being the housekeeper, right? All of these are different roles. If we assume those roles and we perform those roles successfully, then we feel satisfaction with those roles. And these roles in the context of a specific domain, again, generates much positive emotions, satisfaction in that domain, let's say domain of home life, ultimately affecting life satisfaction at large. So understanding the psychology of how people assume roles, how they perform their roles successfully, and the extent to which assuming one role conflicts with another. Let's say, if, for example, if you do a very good job in family life by assuming those different family roles, but by doing so, you usurp a lot of time, energy, and resources away from other life domains like work life, then you end up with role conflict. You end up with role conflict. And role conflict, again, diminishes any kind of positive emotions that you may experience in those domains in which you experience conflict. So one needs to understand how people assume those roles, how they successfully engage in those roles, and how those roles conflict with one another, and understanding and mapping out, role engagement, role performance, and role conflict allows us to map out the dynamic, the interplay between work satisfaction, satisfaction with family life, satisfaction with leisure life, and so forth. So by mapping out all the dynamic, the interplay between those domains in role terms. Okay, now we're going to focus on work well-being as one major domain, and we'll try and understand the psychology of work well-being. But before we move on, let me see if you have any questions. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Do you have any questions at all before we move on? So far, so good? Okay, wonderful. So let's now talk about work well-being. So much work, so much research been done on work well-being. So what is work well-being to begin with? So we'll try and understand what is work well-being, how it is measured, construed, and measured in research in work well-being. And there's a lot of this, of course, comes from industrial organizational psychology, and scholars from the management discipline, especially human resources management. So tons of research on this topic. First of all, we want to distinguish between job satisfaction and life satisfaction. So the idea then is that early on, way back, so you look at the research in human resource management, dating earlier than the 70s, you will see quite a bit of research on job satisfaction. What does it take to get employees feeling satisfied with their job? Okay, so tons and tons of research we have dating all the way back from the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s on job satisfaction. Now, for those people now who had a well-being take on job satisfaction, is that, wait a minute, job satisfaction is not good enough. What we need to do is we need to focus on employees feeling happy with life. It's not enough to just feel satisfied with their job. We need to, expand the scope of our investigation to not only job satisfaction, but to work life, and figure out the relationship between job satisfaction and life satisfaction, understand the mediating conditions, understand the moderating conditions, and therefore all of a sudden now we looked at employee well-being as a concept which is much broader than job satisfaction. So let's try and understand those definitions and measures of work well-being beyond job satisfaction. What is work well-being? So work well-being is meaningful work. So there is constructs and measures of work well-being defined in terms of meaningful work. And the idea there is very simple. That is, meaningful job, a meaningful work environment, meaningful work at large, boosts self-esteem. So it boosts the one's self-esteem, and it gives people a sense of control. It gives people a sense of competence, that they're able to master their environment, and therefore any kind of a meaningful job, meaningful work is work well-being. So work well-being is very much defined and measured in terms of the meaning that is bestowed on the job itself, on the place of work, which is, again, a good definition of work well-being. Another definition is work well-being as an affective response toward the work environment, meaning how we respond emotionally to aspects of the work environment. So way back in the late 60s, there is a concept which developed into a measure that became very foundational, very prominent in industrial organizational psychology, which is called the Job Description Index. And the Job Description Index captures satisfaction with different facets of the work environment. So what are these? I'm looking at the book on page 375. Satisfaction with work, this is one dimension. Satisfaction with pay, another dimension. Satisfaction with promotion policies, another dimension. Satisfaction with supervision, another dimension. And satisfaction with coworkers. So then what you do is you have a composite index, which we call the Job Description Index. And the job description index captures, again, the idea of work well-being. So construing and measuring work well-being, a lot of researchers have used the job description index. Now, you can expand the list on satisfaction with what? And so other researchers have looked at a whole bunch of other dimensions besides these, such as the amount of independence one experience on the job, opportunities you have to use your skills and abilities, working relationships with your supervisor, amount of pay you receive, opportunities for promotion. Again, some of it is embedded in the job description index, but it goes beyond that. Fluctuation in your workload, amount of time you work, time spent traveling on the job, amount of information you receive regarding procedures and forthcoming changes, working relationships with your coworkers, status of your position, kind of work you do, amount of job stress. All of these, again, are dimensions of work well-being, and you develop a composite index capturing, the feelings, the affective, response you have towards those conditions, and you get a good measure of work well-being. Another way of looking at work well-being is through what we call a ratio of positive and negative affect experience at work. So there's a program of research in work well-being that deals with uplifts and hassles. So what are those uplifts that you get at work, and what are those hassles that you experience at work? And then what you do is you get a ratio between all those uplifts and hassles in terms of a whole bunch of dimensions. What are these dimensions? Fellow workers, customers, supervisors, nature of work, workload, job security, meeting deadlines, enough money for necessities, and enough money for leisures. So what you're doing is you're capturing positive and negative affect in relation to these dimensions, these conditions at work. And then you put together a composite index capturing the ratio of uplifts, meaning positive affect, and hassles, meaning negative affect. Again, a reasonable conceptualization and measure of work well-being. Then you have another one, which is work well-being as satisfaction in the work life. Oh, actually, I missed one in the book. I don't have a bullet for it. I need to revise this. I kind of missed, which is called work well-being as need satisfaction through organizational resources, which is kind of funny because this is based on research that I have done with my colleagues, and we developed what we call a quality of work life measure that has been very well established in the literature for those people who want to use that measure. So the idea is, what is the extent to which the organization and the resources that are found in the organization can satisfy a whole bunch of different needs, a la Maslow, for example, physiological needs in terms of economic security, family security, economic security, shelter, physiological needs, safety needs, social needs, esteem needs, self-actualization needs, the need for aesthetic, creativity, and beauty. What is the extent to which the organization can satisfy all of these needs? And we have a very specific measure for that, and that measure has been validated in a variety of settings in relation to a bunch of different populations. It's I wonder whether there's something Freudian about my skipping this one. But it's in the book. Then there's another conceptualization of work well-being that focuses on that really dates back from the social indicators movement back in the 70s. Like, for example, the social surveys of Andrews and Withy and Campbell, Converse, and Rogers in the context of the United States, trying to measure the quality of life. They measured the extent to which people are satisfied in different life domains, right? So again, in Campbell, Converse, and Rogers in 1976, they have measures of family life. How do you feel about your family life? How do you feel about your standard of living? How do you feel about work? Aha, now that's the domain. But there's a whole bunch of other kind of domains like marriage, saving as investment, friendship, city or county, housing, amount of education, neighborhood, usefulness of education, health, religion, on and on, a whole bunch of different domains. Work is one of them. How do you feel about your work life on some sort of a satisfaction rating scale, 1 to 10 or something like that? Highly dissatisfied, highly satisfied. So that's another way of establishing and capturing work well-being. Another one is work well-being as a component of the broader employee well-being concept. So, there's some research that have focused on, wait a minute, we can't just focus on job satisfaction as work well-being. It's much greater than that. We need to inject subjective well-being, psychological well-being, as well as very specific dimensions related to the work environment. So again, people in well-being research have broadened the concept of job satisfaction to include elements of subjective well-being and psychological well-being. And that's how they conceptualized it. Let me give you an example of a measure that has used subjective well-being. We remember early on we talked about Diener's satisfaction with life scale, and it is essentially a 5-item measure. So some people, what they did is they used that measure to capture satisfaction in work life, in the context of subjective well-being. In most ways, my life at work is close to my ideal. The conditions of my life at work are excellent. I'm satisfied with my life at work. So far, I have gotten the important things I want in my life at work. If I was able to live my work life over again, I would change almost nothing. That is almost identical to capturing life satisfaction a la Diener. Diener is Ed Diener is the guru, the dean of subjective well-being research. So that'll sort of give you another way of conceptualizing and measuring work well-being. Now there are others. Paul War from the United Kingdom has done quite a bit of research on work well-being, and he uses a metaphor, a vitamin metaphor, which is kind of very interesting. And it says that work well-being is like a vitamin. For a worker, for an employee to experience well-being at work, you need to give them vitamins. What kind of vitamins? Of course, it's a metaphor. Vitamins such as Oh, well, get to talk about that in the predictors of work well-being. But in essence, war captured work well-being in terms of three dimensions: pleasure and displeasure, comfort and anxiety, and enthusiasm versus depression. So the way he measured that, and then talk about those predictors, those determinants of work well-being. We'll get to talk about that momentarily. But another measure that is becoming very popular in well-being research is the oh, well, I don't have a bullet for that too. My goodness. But anyway, it's the European Commission definition of quality of work life. So the European Commission has done quite a bit of research on that, and the dimensions, it's a composite index of work well-being that focuses on capturing how people experience intrinsic job quality, skills, lifelong learning and career development, gender equality, health and safety at work, flexibility and security, inclusion and access to the labor market, work organization and work-life balance, social dialogue and worker involvement, diversity and non-discrimination, overall economic performance and productivity. And so what you do is you come up with a composite index of all of these dimensions, and voila, you have a measure of work well-being. I'm sorry that I didn't include. I'm going to revise those slides and send you a corrected version. And I will post again those corrected slides on the course website. Okay. Before we transition to talk about how does work well-being contribute to life satisfaction, meaning, again, we're going to try and entertain a sort of a discussion on the theories that link those conditions at work with life satisfaction. So we'll talk about domain satisfaction theories, role theories, resource theories, ego involvement theories, human development theories, and goal theories. Let's take a break now, because that would be a good time to break, and we'll come back and talk about those theories, and then we'll transition into another domain, and the next domain would be residential well-being, meaning housing conditions, community well-being, that kind of thing. That we call it residential. Okay, so 10-minute break, and we'll resume after that. I will see you in 10 minutes. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I'll address that when I come back. So we have a question. Any research on longitudinal study of well-being? I'll address that when I get back. Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, before we hope we can reconvene now. Before we move on, I want to address some of those questions. We have a question from Sadi. Any research on longitudinal study of well-being? Yeah, there's plenty. There are a lot of research on using longitudinal study. But are you asking a question in relation to work well-being, or work well-being in general?
Well-being in general.
In general. Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, right now, there's so much emphasis on longitudinal research. And the reason being is because there's so much cross-sectional research that cannot demonstrate causality. You know, this actually determines that, this causes that. And longitudinal research is much more adept in being able to demonstrate causal effects. One thing leads to another. So yeah, absolutely. And there's so many references in my book on longitudinal research. The second question is from Canu, and which of these theoretical measures have been measured across cultures? I mean, most of the well-being theories are from the West. Are these research in Asia and Africa? Well, that's a good question. Canu. And unfortunately, early on, you know, much of that research came from the West, mostly the United States and Canada and some places in Europe, like the United Kingdom, Australia, and so forth. But just for the last something like 5 years, I've been seeing a lot of stuff that is coming out from Asia. As a matter of fact, there are quite a bit of academic journals that focus on, well, wait a minute, exactly the point that you're making, and that is much of that research is grounded in the West. How about, does it apply to Asian cultures? And so now we see a lot of academic journals that focuses on replicating much of that in what you might call a Oriental or Asian cultures. So yes, it's beginning, meaning that it'll probably take another 20 or 30 years to be able to get to the level where you would feel comfortable with. But we're making some progress. Right. Okay. So we will resume and talk about theories of work well-being. And as you can see from this slide, by the way, I modified this one slide. So the slides that I shared with you has a sort of a modified version of this. But again, I will make some additional changes and post. I'll send those to you by email and then post them to the course website. Okay, let's focus on domain satisfaction theories. Now, we already talked about those in the context of the domain dynamics early on. Those domain satisfaction theories involve spillover. And again, the context of spillover, we talked about bottom-up spillover, right? Top-down spillover, horizontal spillover. These are what you call spillover theories. We talked about segmentation. Border theory is how people, have those borders. They have border between work life and family life and leisure life and social life and community life and spiritual life. They have those borders. And the focus of that theory is on the permeability of the walls, that the psychological walls that are erected between and among those borders, or between and among those domains, I mean. And the idea then, so much research have kind of investigated the permeability of between work life and other life domains like family life, especially family life. So much research on the interplay, the interface between family life and work life. And border theory played quite a bit of an understanding the mechanism of this interplay between work life and family life by looking at the permeability of those two domains and how they are insulated or not insulated. Like, for example, we have a person, we have a family that runs a retail store. That's maybe a convenience store. And they have their residence on top of the store. So they're on top of the store. Well, maybe think in terms of restaurant. A restaurant, they live on top of the restaurant, and during the day they run the restaurant, and they run the restaurant as a family operation. So here we have work life and family life, and the border between work life and family life is so permeable, right? That you can't disentangle work life from family life because they live in the same place, and the nature of the business does not allow them to segment work life from family life. So here we talk about the level of permeability. In this context, we talk about how those domains are integrated. Anyway, so border theory has been used to explain the dynamic between and among those work life and other life domains, such as family life. Role theories, already talked about role theories, and again, it plays a great deal of prominence in the research on work well-being. And again, it focuses on role conflict, the extent to which, assuming a work role conflict or does not conflict with other roles such as family roles, right? So again, much of role theory and the language of role theory have been used to explain that role conflict contributes to work well-being if there is minimal conflict. But if there is quite a bit of conflict, then it takes away from well-being. Boundary, and that is how people place boundaries. And again, it's very much related. It's almost an offshoot of border theory, and it focuses on how people place those boundaries and how they can go in and out of one role, just in the same way we talked about it in context of boundaries, but it's a sort of a different language. They focus more on how people can transition from a family role into a work role by going from one boundary to another, meaning that there's hardly any boundaries between a work life and family life. Anyway, boundary theory, at least in my mind, is very close to border theory. Identity theory, and that is the extent to which a person creates salience of work life vis-a-vis other domain. So some people, for example, some people think their job is just a job. I have a job just to make a living. I need to, feed my family, and it's just a job. It's not very important. It's not salient in the big identity hierarchy. So, but on the other hand, let's say a person would say, "Wait a minute, my job is not a job. My job is a career. So I have a career in being a scientist," and so forth. So, the salience of the identity of the work role is greater than a person who just have a job. Another person who, again, would say, "Wait a minute, my job is a calling, meaning that I'm not only passionate about my career, but I believe in what I do serves society in a very impactful way, in a very prominent way, a very in a way that contributes to society in a most positive way." That's a calling, and therefore the identity of what happens to that person who has this kind of identity affects his life satisfaction much more so than another person who says, well, it's a job, it's just a job, and I'm trying to just make money to feed my families. And for whatever happens on the job doesn't really affect his life satisfaction, right? So it depends on one's identity in the hierarchy of all identities that plays a role on happiness, overall happiness. Make sense? I hope so. Resource theories, scarcity, the facilitation, vitamins, and scarcity is, so there is a very significant and prominent theory, especially in when it comes when we do research on work-life balance, that says that our resources are very finite, that we have limited resources. We have a finite amount of time that we can spend in family and work. We have finite financial resources. We have finite whatever other resources, right, social capital or what have you, that we use to allocate to different roles in different life domains. And therefore, if we use so much of our resources in work life, we don't have hardly any resources, any time or energy left to spend in family life. And therefore, that is a scarce resource. And in order to enhance our well-being and develop what you might call work-life balance, we need to expend those resources wisely. Resources that would go into family life, and resources that would go into work life, resources that would go into social life, leisure life. So again, we need to expend those resources wisely to create balance between and among those different life domains. That's what we call scarcity as a resource type of a theory that is well established in well-being research. Facilitation. There is one particular theory that says that there's role enrichment. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of job enrichment, but role enrichment in industrial organizational psychology and well-being research talks about how engaging in one specific role, let's say maybe a family role, how do you parent? And if you're a parent and you develop parental skills, then learning those parental skills can facilitate your dealing with employees, your coworkers. If you apply the same skills, then what you have learned in the family domain can apply and facilitate role performance in work life, right? That's facilitation, role enrichment. Vitamins, the vitamins. This is where we started talking about vitamins. I have there we are. On page 386, I have the vitamin analogy that's been developed by War from the United Kingdom. Professor War identified 9 aspects of the environment that affect employee well-being and personal happiness. These are called the vitamins. What are the vitamins? Opportunity for personal control, opportunity for skill use, externally generated goals, variety, environmental clarity, contact with others, availability of money, physical security, and valued social position. These are what he might call, again, metaphorically, vitamins. If you have all of these, then you have all the vitamins that you need to have good well-being. I like that, the vitamin analogy. Ego involvement theories, again, engagement. Yeah, there's one particular theory that has been developed in industrial organizational psychology. And it actually it's called the job characteristics model, the job characteristics model. And in this, there's so much research that has been done on the job characteristic model that says that work well-being work well-being can be enhanced through work engagement. So if you're engaged in work in a sort of a full throttle way, then you're very likely to experience high level of work well-being. And the conditions that would allow you to have an employee or a worker fully engaged would be things like skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. So what does that mean? Skill variety. So skill variety, let's say if you have a person maybe on an assembly line that does repeated motion of taking one thing and doing another, doing this and doing that, just in a very repeated way, in a very non-varied way. People specialize to the point where they do one thing and one thing alone. If you're over specializing, then you don't have what you call skill variety. So the job characteristics model says that in order to enhance work well-being, you need to allow the worker to use different skills in various conditions. So much of the job has been sort of redesigned to allow employees to rotate different positions. Let's say if you're in a retail store, instead of just focusing on doing cashier stuff, right? You're on the cashier. No, sometimes you work on the cashier, sometimes you stock inventory, sometimes you clean, sometimes you greet customers, sometimes you do a variety of tasks. So the idea is, if you want to enhance work well-being, allow the employee to engage in a variety of skills, right? So again, that's one of the dimensions that that the job characteristics model emphasize. Again, task identity. Task identity would be things like the extent to which the job becomes part of the person's identity. If you ask a person about who are you, and the person would describe himself or herself in specific terms in relation to those particular tasks on the job, then it's part of his identity, his or her identity. And that's a good thing. So you want to make sure that, again, those job-related tasks become part of the worker's identity, and that would enhance work well-being. On and on. So again, the other ones are skill variety, task identity, task significance, and autonomy and feedback. These are very important in enhancing employee well-being. Another theory is flow theory. Flow theory comes from social psychology and well-being research by by Professor Mikhaili. He's a very long Hungarian name, and it's in there. Sitzkamahali. I used to pronounce it right, but I can't. Sometimes it slips. Anyway, so he developed this flow theory, and that says that if you engage in any kind of activity, it's very likely that activity will contribute to your well-being, your overall sense of well-being, if the activity involves a high skill level that matches your level of skill. Let me give you an example of besides work, let's say maybe in leisure. You play tennis and you play against an opponent who is much less skilled than you are. He's not much of a challenge, not much of a competitor, right? And you're skilled, you're a good tennis player, and the other person is a novice, meaning is just beginning, a beginner. Well, you're not going to experience flow. You're not going to experience any sense of well-being if it's, the level of skills would be so unmatched. If they are matched, that means your skill level is up there and the opponent's skill level up there, then you experience flow. Then when you play tennis with that opponent, you become totally absorbed in the game and you feel a sense of flow, he calls it. And flow it contributes to well-being. Now imagine the same thing at work. If you engage in tasks that you are very skillful at, and those tasks match your skill level, engaging in those tasks gives you a sense of flow, ultimately contributing to your overall sense of well-being. That's flow theory. Human development theories that we have, hygiene factors versus motivator. Sometimes we call it a two-factor theory, and then we have self-determination. We already talked about self-determination in another context, right? You know what self-determination theory in terms of intrinsic motivation and in terms of those needs, the three basic psychological needs, the need for autonomy, the need for relatedness, the need for competence. So the idea is that at work, if an employee, if a worker experiences autonomy, makes autonomous decisions rather than the supervisor exactly tells him what to do, right? That's autonomy. If that person experiences autonomy, that person experiences competence, that feels that he is mastering those tasks at work, and ultimately experience relatedness with other employees. That means, the other employees are treated like family and friends. That again would satisfy the need for relatedness. That would contribute overall to a sense of well-being, work well-being, and overall well-being. That's self-determination. Now, going back to two-factor theory, which is hygiene factors versus motivators. This is another theory that has been well established in industrial organizational psychology way back in the 60s, actually. And it has sort of blossomed into a major theory in well-being. And it says that those factors that causes job dissatisfaction are different from those that cause job satisfaction. So it's a two-factor meaning that, again, we need to distinguish between factors that lead to satisfaction versus factors that lead to dissatisfaction. Those factors that lead to dissatisfaction or job dissatisfaction are what we call hygiene factors. Hygiene factors. What are they? If you don't make hardly any money at work, if you're very dissatisfied with your work, that creates dissatisfaction. But if your pay is good, that's not going to lead to much satisfaction. It's going to feed into dissatisfaction much more so than satisfaction. But if you have something like autonomy at work, if you feel autonomous in making a host of important decisions at work, now that's the kind of thing that leads to job satisfaction. That's a motivator, right? So it's a two-factor theory distinguishing hygiene factors from what we call motivators. And the idea is, of course, you need to have hygiene factors and you need to have motivators, and you have to have those two sets of factors that would contribute to work well-being. Goal theories, we have selection of optimization. This is a theory that says, work well-being is very much dependent on the way you select, goals that are important to achieve work-related tasks, work-related outcomes, and the way if you select a goal and ultimately fail at that goal, how you optimize by modifying those goals in a way that ultimately would help you achieve important goals at work. And if you achieve important goals at work, then that kind of generates a sense of work well-being, leading to overall sense of well-being. Time management is a theory that is also well established, and that it's all depends on time and how you manage your time at work. If you're not good at time management, then it's very likely that you will experience work ill-being rather than well-being, and vice versa. So time management is very important. And what is that? And how do you go about managing your time? You prioritize your goals and you allocate a certain amount of time to different tasks to accomplish different goals. That's the sort of the gist of the theory. Goal selection and implementation we already talked about that in the context of goal theory. And that is goal valence. You set goals that are positively and highly valenced, and these goals have to have good or high expectancies, and you go about implementing those goals and recognizing those, the extent to which you've achieved those goals, and that, in essence, that's the theory that has been applied in a work context, and it explains a lot of positive and negative emotions in a work setting. Okay, so the thing that we didn't get a chance to look at are the predictors of work well-being. But again, this is something that's easy. It's the next slide. Oops. It's the next slide. And it's very easy to understand. There are certain conditions that contribute to work well-being: work environment, from opportunity or personal control, opportunity of skill use, on and on. So a whole bunch of theories based on research that says these are the factors, these are the work environmental factors that lead to work well-being. There are things that are employee characteristics, from affective disposition, the big five, core self-evaluation, age and gender. Again, much research have been able to suggest that, again, these factors contribute to well-being. And the discussion in the book allows you to understand a little bit more about these work-related behaviors and so forth. We're out of time, so I'm not going to be able to get into that. But I'm going to leave that part for you to read in the book. And then next time we'll start with residential well-being, okay? I don't have any questions, which is good because we're out of time. My goodness. Okay, so I bid you adieu for at least for the time being, and I will see you next week, and we'll we'll carry on, carry on by talking about all these other wonderful topics. Bye now.
Hi. Thank you.
You're very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye bye.